Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the one-of-a-kind Mr. Rex Murphy.
Thank you very much. I should just start by saying that I'm simply very grateful to be here. As you know, according to the laws of Newtonian mechanics, one wretched body cannot be in two places at the same time. So the fact that I'm here in Weyburn right now means that I'm not in Toronto. See? I should just clear up a few things. I have this wonderful hat on, which was given to me by one of your exhibitors, not to frame my otherwise angelic face. What? Rather to shield you from the almost Trudeau-esque splendor, the shine and sheen of my wonderful hair. If you had to stare at that for the whole of this meal, you'd leave here dazzled. I was also giving this, which I understand is a whacking stick. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, I tell you what, if it's useful on the farm, and I gather that it is nothing as compared to the utility it would have and will have as I bring it back to Toronto. I could get a whole week at the CBC alone with this. And then I'd have to order another one because it would be worn down. Stay there. Again, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm serious about that. I don't get out very much, and rarely by invitation. But I genuinely, and I can say this without attempting to appease the audience, I genuinely like to come out west. There are connections, and I'm going to tie a couple of them together. But there are secondary reasons, too, why it's good to be invited out. I have learned that for every degree of latitude that you travel west from Toronto, your IQ increases by 3 points. Didn't mean to bring this up, but I'm at it now. I arrived in Toronto before the global apocalypse was on the daily papers, and they were still familiar with terms like snow. And I arrived there during you've all heard of this. I arrived there about a couple of weeks before they had that tremendous Antarctic blizzard, 1998 I think it was, in which the Torontonians, caught in the maelstrom of nature's angriest moment, had to summon the Canadian Army to deal with snow on the streets in February. And being a Newfoundlander, I was out wondering when it was going to turn winter. I'm just going to give you the image. It's not funny, but it stays in my mind. I went out, I was on Yonge Street, standing under a street light. I wasn't selling anything. Who would buy? But across the way, this is a wonderful image. Across the way, there was a Second Cup, one of those more upscale coffee shops. Like, that's the place that people go who can't pronounce Tim. And in front of it was one of these great, huge army vehicles that you see in the Afghan theater. And sitting all around on top of it were the Canadian soldiers in their camouflage uniforms, holding actual rifles. And coming out of the Second Cup was this, I presume, sergeant or captain. And in his left hand, in his right arm, he was cradling some wicked rifle. And in his left arm, high up, was a styrofoam tray and carrying Swiss almond maca to the boys in uniform during the Antarctic blizzard And I took an estimate of the circumstance. I figured that if you had a big broom, and Yonge Street is the longest street in the world, you had a big broom and you went the entire length of Yonge Street, you would not collect enough snow to dust a donut. Now, do you understand why these people are confused about the weather? That's the point. That's irrelevant, incidentally. That has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about. I'm in full digression mode, and I haven't even begun. How do you leave the path unless you're on it? I have one little story that I have to tell. It was brought to mind by a stray reference. I did some stories on the Canadian farm 10, 15 years ago. Came out 3 or 4 times when the family farm in particular was under very grievous strains. And this happened about 4 or 5 years after the Newfoundland fish stocks had collapsed. And I don't have time to expand on that, but I'll just give you 2 or 3 hard numbers. When Mr. Crosby announced that the offshore fishing was now finished, put on moratorium, there were 31,000 inshore fishermen that in a single moment were no longer allowed to fish. They were no longer allowed to jump in a dory, go out half a mile, jig a codfish, put it on the table, and have supper. It was the first time in 500 years. And just to give you an idea how big 31,000 is with reference to the population of Newfoundland, if you had been in Toronto the next day, and I hope you weren't, and if you had picked up the Globe and Mail, and I hope even more fervently that you wouldn't, and you would have seen a headline, if the same thing had happened in Ontario, 660,000 Ontarians out of work in a single day. That's how big the blow was. Now, I'm not going to expand it, but I will come back to it when I talk about the resource industries. I did a film on it. I'll make this really quick. And we did a full half hour, talked to all the fishermen. It was really sad stuff, people selling their houses to get airplane tickets to find a job on the mainland, people deserting places that they'd lived in for 4 generations. The outports were being devastated. I mean, it was really, really sad. So I did this thing, and I wasn't working. Well, no one really works at the CBC. You got to find an immediate verb. It's something a little less energetic. But I was still in Newfoundland when we did the film, and it got shown on the network. And this is about 98, 99 or somewhere around there. Anyway, I was told by CBC management, this is in the days before people had graduated to the high literacy of email. This is when they actually still wrote letters and were familiar with the alphabet and would spell U, Y-O-U. And R wasn't a single letter. The mail, this is true, there were thousands of letters that came in to St. John's CBC, directed to me, because I was the so-called face of it, and overwhelming sympathy and support. And I got calls from the national newsroom saying they had never, I'm not bragging, they had not seen this kind of response to any program in anything like a proportion. 30 letters was supposed to be really good. 100 was, this was a major issue. 150, Jean Chrétien had choked someone. But we're talking thousands. And some of them even had money. Where do you think I got this vest? So I said, okay, I know all about this. I know what happened. Newfoundlanders are a closed bunch, and I'm one of them. And so I tell the story of my own fellows. It goes on a network, and even though it's a sad story, the Newfoundlanders are pleased that their story gets out. Anyway, about 3 or 4 months later, I get up to Toronto, and I finally put in a room with all the mail bags. And here's what I learned. It wasn't the Newfoundlanders, and it wasn't the BCers or any of the northern on the coasts. It was the prairies. 80 to 85% of all of this tremendous sympathetic mail, tremendously friendly, had come from farmers or farmers' families. And I genuinely, I'm not a very quick guy, I was puzzled. So skip forward, about 3 or 4 years later, I'm doing the story of the family farmer. We're in Redvers, if I remember correctly. And there was a three family farm, by which I mean grandfather, father, son. And we were in the barn for purposes of having an interview. And I just mentioned this to the older gentleman. I said, you know, when I did this story about Newfoundland and the fishery collapsing, all these poor inshore fishermen really getting done in, I said, I thought we'd get, you know, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland the letters. But, you know, it was you guys. You guys out on the prairie that more than any other bunch, by far. And he said, what is wrong with you? Have you no memory? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, out in the 30s. He said, but you guys were still bobbing around on your own out in the North Atlantic. You weren't even in Canada. When the Dust Bowl and when the Depression and when the great calamity hit the prairies. And by the way, we had no town councils. We had no government. In other words, life was perfect. It was the individual tiny little communities, some no larger than 100, and individual fishermen and their wives and their sons and daughters. They plugged up the great salt barrels full of salt fish. And I really don't know how they did it, because transportation in Newfoundland was mainly by boat to finally get it to St. John's. But somehow they got the barrels of salt fish and they sent them out way across the prairies. And he said, we were out here. And then he said, you know, 3 or 4 huge barrels of salt fish. We were having the roughest time of our lives. He said, do you think we forget that? So there's 2 points that I'd make about the story. One is that, you know, you read the news or you read even some of the history books. But some of the great stories of Canada are sub-stories. They're stories where the people, and just the people, somehow or other have bonds with each other. They sense each other's need or desperation, and a great act of kindness just comes as an impulse. And here were the prairies, it's about 65 years later, expressing thank you over 6 decades. So I thought that was, I thought that was a wonderful people confederation story. And I was very pleased to hear it. So I told it, as I'm telling it now, a lot. But it had, by the way, I can't resist this, it had one wonderful rider. I was so proud of this and how farmers and fishermen are, in some ways, by the way, kind of a reverse mirror, land, sea, but the toil, the connection with the elements, water, rain, wind, soil, it's the same temperament, it's the same sensibility. So I was out at a trade school, I think it was in Saskatchewan, and a whole bunch of young people, especially a young woman right up in front. I told this great story and how it shows how sweet Confederation is. Anyway, as soon as I finished, and people applauded it, she shot her hand up. She said, my grandfather got a couple of barrels of that salt fish. I said, well, he did, my Lord. Yes, he said, he didn't know what to do with it. I said, he didn't know what to do with it? I said, well, what did he do with it? Well, she said, he buried it. I said, he buried it? Yes, she said, he buried it. I said, do you know where? And she thought a minute. She said, yeah, I do. I said, well, still good. Now, the last reason I'll give you for being grateful to be here is that in the old days, I've stopped there about a couple of years ago, but when I was kind of lurking around the CBC, usually at midday, at the kind of a secular angelus, they'd send me from the 4th floor, which is where the newsrooms are, down to the main lobby, where it was my duty to water the ferns, and light the candles, and refresh the incense, in front of the statue we have there to the patron saint of other people's basement space heaters, whom you may know as Bishop Suzuki. And you really cannot imagine how deprived I feel not to be doing that right now. And just as other fragments of news, Catherine McKenna, whose only contribution to enlightenment is not to interrupt it when it's happening. Oh, it's true. She was down in Newfoundland recently, I think last week sometime, and she observed the great run of icebergs coming down from Iceberg Alley. It's one of the great, by the way, if you ever get a chance to visit Newfoundland in May for the run of the icebergs, it's truly one of the great spectacular things of nature. So anyway, she saw the icebergs, and I think she goes to the same postgraduate university as Leonardo DiCaprio. And you know, he's the guy who discovered the Chinook. Which is all the proof you need to know that they're absolutely right about apocalyptic global warming. Anyway, Catherine discovered the icebergs. And she issued, as she always does, I mean, her Twitter feed is something like a kind of repeat of the Enlightenment. She pointed out that once again, we have vivid evidence that global warming is, you know, look at these icebergs, my God, global warming. Do you know what the year was when the Titanic sank? 1912, I believe. It was sank by an iceberg. So now we know that the tragedy of the Titanic was because some people somewhere were abusing plastic straws. We live in a very, very strange world. So I'll go to the center of this. I gave you that little bit about Newfoundland, and I will keep this little bit brief as well. But I just want to make something that even though you already know it, it doesn't hurt to hear it again. I'm a great follower or fan of Samuel Johnson, the great English lexicographer, great essayist, probably the most powerful literary mind in the last 300 years. But he was a man of great common sense. And one of the things he said that sticks with me all the time, he said this, that people, men and women, more often need to be reminded than informed. People more often need to be reminded than informed. There are things you know so well that in a sense you cease to think of them. They are so familiar to you that they become part of your daily consciousness, but not in any focus. It's just the way things are, and you forget some of the most blatant considerations of your own existence. And in this case, everybody here knows that when Newfoundland went down, that was the biggest crisis we had in at least 100 years. That the one relief in the darkest hour, with the great cultural industry of the fishery, the defining cultural, economic, social settlement, the defining element of the entire nature of Newfoundland springs from the fishery. So it was psychological, it was spiritual, it was economic. The only relief of substance that came our way was when so many men, women, old and young, some of them, as I said, selling their houses, headed out west, because that was during the period when the oil industry and related industries were at their best. And such is the nature, again, of Canadians dealing with Canadians. There were no embargoes, no signs put up, stay away. I've estimated that over time, there are over about 30,000 Newfoundlanders got out to that, stayed in many cases for 8, 9, 10, 12 years. I saw families that were about to break up because of the economic crash that stayed together. I saw some that did break up, but once husband or wife found work, those pressures that come on you when you are out of work, when you can't give your daughter the price of a ticket to a small concert, when the father sits at home and feels useless, and when the mother is in a state of anxiety as to how she is going to prepare the future of her children. Employment is not just a damn paycheck. It is the spine of most people's existence. And outside of family life itself and mortality, I don't think there's anything more savage that visits a human personality than someone who wishes to work and who has been working and has worked no more, and then has to face the humiliations of either borrowing, begging, or going on some government program. Most people guard their dignity by their own self-reliance. And that dignity is a function that spreads throughout the entire family. And so many of ours, as I call them, came out your way, and they found that work, and they saved their families. They kept their esteem. They sent money home to parents. I mean, it was one of the, again, you will never read about it, and you will never see it on a television set, because it is a benign outcome of the fiendish oil industry. It was one of the great moments of Confederation that all people from all over Canada were summoned to the western provinces, and people from provinces who had never intermingled before were working on the same project or allied projects. My closest friend, my very closest friend, 55 years of age, got 10 years' work. He had never left the fishing town of Mobile on the south coast. Do you know where he is this morning? This very morning. He's in Saskatchewan at his daughter's farm. His son is on a rig in New Mexico, down in Mexico. His daughter came out as well, met one of your wonderful Saskatchewan farmers, sized him up, figured he had a lot of money, and she, well, of course. So she's now got a really good car, 2 kids. She's as happy, as we say, as a clam. And the father, the grandfather now, he just loves coming up. He spends 2 or 3 months sometimes helping the son-in-law at the farm. All of this would not happen without the resource. That's something I wanted to remind you of. You already know these things. But has it ever registered deeply in your consciousness just how significant that is? That a renovation of Confederation at the citizen level takes place when a major project invites the brains and the muscle of Canadians together at a common task and brings them in contact with each other from all parts of the country. And they learn by contact and common effort that this is what we share. This is what we have in common. And despite what you've heard, it is unity first, and it is shared experience, and it is common endeavor that constitutes the actual cement of a national feeling. And in that sense, this great project that you are, in one way or the other, associated with, is the 21st century renovation of the Confederation. But instead, what's been the story? I'm ancient. I was around when they were manufacturing the linens for the mummies. But however old I am, I cannot come up with an understanding. And I try. Not partisan. I try. I cannot figure out. I do not know what processes are going on in what strange minds that has turned almost the entire energy of the country, especially at government level and especially at the level of the various NGOs and self-appointed monitors of the Earth's doom, that has made the oil industry the #1 villain of the entire world. You wouldn't know, but they were up there manufacturing sarin gas. You had that moronic Neil Young, and surely there are a few strings loose on that guitar. You had him with the audacity and the insult of comparing the working of thousands of men and women, supporting their families, providing an essential, the essential commodity, energy. It is the essential commodity of all 21st century life. Doing it honestly, doing it according to the rules, and doing it in a political environment that compared to any other environment in the world, China, Nigeria, Venezuela, is the acme of responsible management. And of all the projects in the world that Neil Young wants to downgrade and call Hiroshima, that's a slander. And I suppose if you're living with Daryl Hannah, you have a limited range of reference. But you've had for 20 years and more various strategies, various tactics. It is the dirtiest oil on the planet. If Fort McMurray goes on, the planet is doomed. Dear God, is it the only oil project in all the world? I believe there are 1.6 billion Chinese who are putting out coal plants 3 to the hour. India is not a small country. It's investing in energy. It's using coal. Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Latin America. There are more jurisdictions than you care to count. And I'll ask this room silently. When have you heard of an equivalent protest against Venezuelan oil, Chinese coal, Nigerian oil? Why is it that the most impeccable political regime on earth, mesmerized by the fantastic obsessions of environmentalism, does this so cleanly, and it alone has been made a campaign target, a symbol, and they have the gall to tell you, that if you do this, the world is doomed. We are in for an eco-apocalypse. This is garbage. It is insane garbage. I don't see Greenpeace romping around Russia. I don't see them leaving long, long drapes over the Chinese wall. I don't see them scuttling up the legs of the rigs off Nigeria because the pirates would be chomping at their ass from behind. And that's the outside view. We have them inside. Where's the defense? This industry, let me repeat it, people more often need to be reminded than informed. We are now living at the very peak of Canada's development. The very peak. All that you have now, I mean, the glory of this town alone, the beauty of it, the clarity of it, the space, the sun, and the peace. This is magnificent. This is something that the majority of people through history and on the earth at the present minute have no idea of. This is a very sophisticated community. And we're in 2019 when we have such tremendous technologies and we have resources we never dreamed of before. We have abilities that my own father, were he still alive, would struggle to comprehend that it even exists. When he was 15, barefoot and trying to find a job in the woods, if you could flash him forward to what's available now, all of which, everything, technology, computers, cars, transportation, airplanes, all the devices in your home, all the protections provided by the armed services, all the great sophisticated medical equipment, everything comes to the wealth that is generated from resources and only functions if you have a ready supply of energy. So where in this country did this mindset occur that suddenly the greatest resource of all, which we have in abundance thanks to providence or God, is something that in the government circles, the environmental circles, and in those absolutely demented conclaves around Queen Street, oh, this is going to kill us, this is the end of the world. They couldn't last 15 minutes without a Sky Dome television set. They go down in 50,000 strong to look at a screen that's the size of Idaho to watch the Raptors. And by the way, the Raptors, that's a very curious psychological thing. All of Toronto is just incented. It's gone ecstatic over the Raptors. I know what's going on. This is the last stage of grief. It's compensation for the Maple Leafs. The jihad against pipelines. How is it that in the 21st century, in a country that is so contingent on its natural resources, that we now have a situation where on the federal level, they have a thing called the National Energy Board. I think you could make salad with it. I have a joke for you, by the way. I haven't told you any jokes. I got one good joke, though. This is a good joke, and I'm going to tell it. I don't care if you want to hear it or not. You remember when Mr. Trudeau was elected? I know it was sad, but remember when Mr. Trudeau was elected, very shortly after that, I'm quoting, I got a good memory. He said one of the things that this new government is going to make sure, one of its very, very first priorities, is that we are going to restore the confidence of the Canadian people in the processes of the National Energy Board. We are going to restore the confidence of the Canadian people in the processes of the National Energy Board. We are going to revive it. And you know something? I remember I travel around a lot within Canada. We had the big hurricane in Newfoundland about, 3-4 years ago. I was down visiting my brother. He lives in a town called Sunnyside, which is the biggest lie in Newfoundland. And he said, the storm finally abated, the roads were ripped apart. I mean, really, 30, 40-foot gaps. The hurricane was wicked. And a rainstorm. So we managed to get out. Half the town had to use a boat to get around because the road was broken too. We finally got to a coffee shop over in Arnold's Cove. And all the old men in particular, they gather, as you know, for the morning coffee and chat over the news and tremendous hurricane, and houses blowing apart. And so I walked in and saw the boys, you hear mumbling. And I said, I suppose it's, bad news with the hurricane. And he looks up, no, boy, he says, not the hurricane. I said, well, what is it? Well, he said, we don't have any confidence in the processes of the National Energy Board. Yeah. And everywhere I went in Canada, the story was the same. Go to an airport, clogged up, 3-day storm, everything closed down. I walked up to a couple of old stranded passengers. I said, must be pretty hard, lying on the floor here 3 or 4 nights. No, he said, no. But he said, that energy board, I don't have confidence in their processes. Dear Lord, what planet and what spaceship? So we have a situation where we take what is supposed to be an environmental review and we multiply it. Trans Mountain has had, I think, 17 court cases. I mean, that's longer than the Spanish Inquisition. They've had innumerable protests. They did a year and a half consulting, and it's still going on. The environmental review process, which is supposed to answer a question, if you do this, will it have predictable harm of sufficient extent that the project should be denied? And if it does, it should. But it doesn't take 8 years to find that out. And it doesn't take one review to say it won't, and then demand a second review to see if you can get it wrong this time. Environmental review has become a tool of absolute and deliberate obstruction of every major economic activity as it relates to most of the energies of the West. This is no longer someone speaking against something. This is a declaration of the fact. Keystone XL. I met the guy who was the chief Canadian negotiator for over 9 years on Keystone XL during the entire 8 years of the Obama administration, and he's supposed to be the good president. During the entire 8 years, he couldn't get a meeting. The State Department twice said it was a good project. It was overruled. He kept temporizing until almost the very last day of his tenure, and then he went off to that great Paris coven that they call the IPCC meeting, and he said to buy himself credentials as an American president at the IPCC meeting on the environment and global doom, he said after 8 years, no. 8 years to get a no that was already determined 8 years previously. And then the guy that everybody is so pleased to compare to Herod on a bad day, he gets into office and he's supposed to be an absolute monster. In 3 days, he approves Keystone. There's something wrong with our scales, folks. There really is. And up here in Canada, Mr. Trudeau gets in with Mr. Butts and Catherine McKenna, and when they go off on a conference about the environment, they take half the population of New Brunswick and all the population of PEI with them. And then they try to say that the environment and the economy go hand in hand. How many times have they been up to Fort McMurray with 400 people? How many times have they come out here, sat down for a couple of days, told the press to go away, met with the people that are sitting at these tables without any fanfare, without any, just to say, hey, I know the strains that are going on. I'm at least aware of them. I'm aware about how that great environmental propaganda push, international in origin, that great push has been clouding your industry and impeding it worldwide. And as your Prime Minister, as a person who understands wealth and who understands even more jobs, the dignity of work, the idea of investment, the idea of reliance, the satisfaction that comes from starting business or conducting business or hiring for business. This is the nation. I understand that. That's the key. And I will protect the environment. But by God, I will give the economy, which is the beginning of every other thing, at least a chance to breathe. And we get in a situation where East Coast canceled at a snap of the finger. I don't think people even know that East Coast was a proposition. Trans Mountain held up. You know something? I think if the pyramids had a national energy review, they'd still be measuring the stones. Can you imagine poor old Johnny MacDonald if you had Elizabeth May in the Sierra Club in the 19th century? What? You're going to connect Saskatchewan and Alberta with iron rails? Not on my Green Party watch. The environmentalists have only one word, and it's the easiest word in any language. It is no. Name one project, one, that has been proposed by a government or a responsible business, just one in any province, to which environmental groups, green groups have said yes. Just one. You can't. They don't. They are zealously, ideologically, and in my view, obsessively determined to rip the fabric of the natural economy away. And the fact that they have gained such influence that even the politicians, even the executives of oil companies are afraid to challenge them simply on the grounds of worth. If any other country in the world had the abundance of land and industry and mineral and farm and energy sources that we have, they would go to their knees to their respective gods and offer hymns of gratitude. And we have here a government that in so many ways tangles, mortifies, harasses, manacles, delays, and at the end you're promised one pipeline that is already there, that was only sold because you tied up the possibility so firmly that they couldn't build its extension. And then they try to make that a boast. They're the reason that the damn thing was sold, not the heroes of it buying. It's easy to understand. You know something? There's another little thought. If oil rigs and great drilling and tremendous technology and refinement, if these elements were in Ontario, the oil rig would be a national monument. And you know that. The news media have been derelict. If you're telling the possible story of the threat of oil, and it is grotesquely over-exaggerated, grotesquely, you owe it also to tell the good that comes from it. No city on this continent could last 3 days without something close to civil war. That's not an exaggeration. If the power went. There's nothing in the 21st century civilization which is a harvest of comforts, miracles, and devices that none of us wish to get rid of. None of those could exist. The fact that your life and the lives of your children are so much in terms of security, in terms of real substantial comfort, in terms of fulfilling their potential either through education or experience. You are the most blessed generation since this country was formed. And you are that way because people before you, in much harder circumstances, and with none of those devices, and with much greater labor, greater sweat, greater fear, and the spirit of sacrifice, that they, piece by piece by piece, put the blocks together, and each generation tried in its own way, sacrificially too, thinking always towards their children, that the next generation will be better, it will have more. Not in terms of greed, but that life cannot always be a fight against nature, and it can't always be going out 200 miles in the North Atlantic in the middle of a storm so you get enough food for your family. There must be some space in which the human spirit too can amplify itself in learning, in sociability, in music, in reading. You are the beneficiaries of generations. And I think one of the little problems that we have is that we reach such a point that in contrast with those before us, and in contrast with the majority citizens of this world, 2/3 of this world lives in anger and pain and threat, mutilation, prison, and sometimes death. We are exempted so much from the horrors of so much of the world and of history because we have built a country. And one of the things that a successful country does is that it ensures first the security of its citizens and then their potential for living a reasonably full life. And here we are now with certain elements in our society attempting by their obsessive ideological opposition to the very system that maintains them, they want to shut down the central elements, the economic foundation of the civilization that they are so happy to both exploit and simultaneously scorn. You need more courage from your governments. You need more courage from your leaders. What you are doing, farm, oil, fish, these are the fundamentals of life. Don't be ashamed of the industry. Don't buy the indictments of its enemies. Don't be the only country in the world that for the purchase of some cheap merit badge from the idiots at the United Nations shuts down a viable, clean, responsible, but most importantly, an essential industry. People in cities have their virtues. They also have their blind spots. They do not know where things come from. They don't know the stretch of land outside this building. They don't know all this equipment that you are now using in the 21st century to multiply yield. They have no idea that oil has to be found, that vast sums of capital have to be brought in its pursuit, that the greatest engineers and scientists and technologists have to figure out new ways of reaching it, of the refining of it, and a secure delivery. I'll wrap it up this way. It's a strange world. Poor Fort Mac, I'll go back to that. I've been up there many times. And when the oil prices collapsed, that was a blow. That was a terrible blow. And then what happened? You had that tremendous inferno, the great northern town where so many Canadians from everywhere had gathered, blasted by an inferno. And you may not know this, a little later, they had a flood. But the only thing left that would have put them in the darkest, deepest hole of hell was if DiCaprio came up for another visit. But oil prices gone, capital in flight, town burns, town has floods, town is libeled internationally, and at that moment, the Alberta government, with the federal urging, they must have sensed that the corpse was still twitching on the table. They introduced a carbon tax. Well, he may still breathe. I mean, really, folks, where does this come from? Human lips should not be allowed to close on the words carbon tax until the day that there are pipelines in the ground full of oil delivering it to foreign markets. Let me close with a small anecdote. I fear I've been too evangelistic, but I believe Tommy Douglas used to hang around here, so I feel in good company. Let me tell you a little story. It's a true story. It doesn't make it any better, but it is true. Newfoundland again. I've told it everywhere. Half of you probably heard it. I don't care. 1997. Back home, we decided to celebrate the 500th anniversary. It was 500 years when John Cabot, who was an Italian, and he was in Bristol, England for some reason, decided to go in search of Peking, China, and ended up in Bonavista, Newfoundland. That's a maritime error of some considerable magnitude. It is. Kind of explains why we elect some of the politicians we do back home. And by the way, even worse than you think, I mean, even in 1497, it's difficult to confuse Peking and a fog-bound rock on the north coast of Newfoundland. And worse again, it wasn't until even 1987 that Bonavista even had a Chinese restaurant. Okay? Anyway, I got to keep it short because Dana's going to beat me up. She came over. I was one of the film crews. This was a real royal visit. So all, camera crews from all over the world. But it was a disaster. There was rain, there was fog, sleet, snow, icebergs coming down with Catherine McKenna screaming behind him. There was so much bad weather, you couldn't see her. It was June the 24th. So we said, they don't know she's here. But we're a smart people. We said, we're going to fix this. They brought her into St. John's for the next day. And they said, we'll leave her indoors. Doesn't matter what the weather is. And they picked a place that means a lot to Newfoundlanders. This is the key. You might laugh at it, but it's a biscuit factory. Something like Tim Hortons across Canada, multiply that by 100, and you got how close Purity biscuits are to Newfoundlanders. I'm Catholic. I grew up on Purity round milk lunch biscuits. My friend Leo White, who's Protestant, and besides going to hell, well, he will. He grew up on Purity square milk lunch biscuits. Point of my telling you, it didn't matter what your denomination, what your background, what your ethnic, there was a Purity biscuit for everyone in Newfoundland. That's why she's going to the Purity biscuit factory. She's showing fealty. So she's there, and I'm making the story short. She's there, and there's a dais about the height of this. And in front of it, 3 steel vats, about 15 feet high, containing 3,000 pounds each of warm biscuit dough, being twirled by giant electric blenders that are being controlled by a man in a white suit on the platform here. She's on the platform. She's got that purse, by the way, so she's on a tilt. And she leans over to where Buddy is, and the biscuit dough is twisting and twirling all over the place. I can't do her accent. I remember where she is, the Purity Biscuit Factory. And she's looking up at Buddy, and she says, "And what are you making, sir?" There was a pause as long as the Reformation. And Buddy finally says, $13.50 an hour, ma'am. Let me just wrap it up, 2 or 3 things. The attack on the industry is unjustified. The lack of defense from general leadership is both pathetic and has to change. Abandon any shadow of mortification or so-called shame that has been blasted into your head that the oil industry and associated industries are somehow Machiavellian and evil, and especially that the prophets, the failed prophets of eco-doom, who have predicted more non-fulfilled prophecies in the last 30 years, don't listen to them. We should not be governing the state of the Canadian economy and the political well-being of all these Western provinces by the jabberings of very disreputable, ideological eco-fanatics. And finally, I found this out before. I found it out in Weyburn, I've been here. Found it out in Humboldt, found it in Redvers, found it in Calgary. If you want hospitality, head west, young man, head west. Thanks.